Breaking news with Valerie and Marina here. On the 27th of March 2017, nuclear ban treaty negotiations began.
At the UN, the majority of the world's governments began negotiations on a treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons and eliminate them completely.
Let's look back at how this all started.
Hi, I'm Paulina.
Hi, I'm Melissa.
And we're going to teach you the science behind nuclear weapons. In 1931, deuterium was discovered.
In 1932, the neutron was discovered.
In 1934, Fermi created the first nuclear fission.
In 1939, scientists conducted nuclear fission regularly.
In 1939, Einstein wrote a letter to Roosevelt on the possibility of a uranium weapon.
In 1942, the Manhattan Project was established in the U.S. The U.S. set up the Manhattan Project to develop the first nuclear weapon. It employed more than 130,000 people and cost the U.S. $2 billion. In 1945, the U.S. conducted its first ever nuclear test. The U.S. government tested its first nuclear weapon, codenamed Trinity, in New Mexico. Its yield equaled 20,000 tons of TNT. The date of the test marks the beginning of the nuclear age.
Back in 1945, our old reporter, Wyatt Grauman, stood on the grounds of Hiroshima just days after being bombed.
Let's take a look back at that news report.
I'm standing here on August 6, 1945, where the U.S. had just dropped a uranium bomb on the Japanese city, Hiroshima. I have gotten word that there will be more than 140,000 deaths and that many more will occur later on due to radiation poisoning.
A few days later, the U.S. dropped a second bomb on Nagasaki. The U.S. exploded a plutonium bomb over Nagasaki. An estimated 74,000 people died by the end of 1945. Little could be done to ease the suffering of the victims who survived the blast. In 1946, the UN called for the elimination of atomic weapons. In its first resolution, the UN General Assembly called for the complete elimination of nuclear weapons and set up a commission to deal with the problem of the atomic discovery. In 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first nuclear bomb. The Soviet Union exploded a nuclear weapon codenamed First Lightning. It became the second nation to develop and successfully test a nuclear device. The tests of the two nuclear weapons grew political tensions all throughout the world. The two bombings greatly affected the interactions between humans and the environment because they decreased the population of Japan by hundreds of thousands.
In 1952, the UK tested their first nuclear weapon in Australia. Following this, in 1952, the US tested their first hydrogen bomb, creating issues between countries involving political matters and social matters. In 1954, the US conducted the massive Bravo test. In 1955, the Russell-Einstein Manifesto was issued. Bertrand Russell, Albert Einstein, and other leading scientists issued a manifesto warning of the dangers of nuclear warfare and urging all governments to resolve disputes peacefully. In 1958, the UK disarmament campaign was formed. This campaign for nuclear disarmament in the UK held its first meeting. After this, in 1959, nuclear tests had been banned in Antarctica. The Antarctic Treaty opened for signature. It established that any nuclear explosion in Antarctica and the disposal there of radioactive waste material should be prohibited.
In 1960, France tests its first nuclear weapon. France explodes its first atomic bomb in the Sahara Desert. It has a yield of 60 to 70 kilotons. It later moves its nuclear tests to the South Pacific. These continue up until 1996. In 1961, the largest ever bomb test was conducted. The Soviet Union explodes the most powerful bomb ever, a 58 megaton atmospheric nuclear weapon nicknamed the Tsar Bomba, over Novaya Zemlya off northern Russia. Since it was the largest bomb test conducted, it was a major breakthrough in nuclear weapons. In 1962, the Cuban Missile Crisis occurs, a tense standoff between when the U.S. discovers Soviet missiles in Cuba. The U.S. blockades Cuba for 13 days. The crisis brings the U.S. and Soviet Union to the brink of nuclear war. In 1963, the Partial Test Ban Treaty opens for signature. A treaty banning nuclear testing in the atmosphere, outer space, and underwater is signed in Moscow.
If this treaty fails, it will not be our doing. And even if it fails, we shall not regret that we have made this clear and honorable national commitment to the cause of man's survival. For under this treaty, we can and must still keep our vigil in defense of freedom. But this treaty need not fail. This small step toward safety can be followed by others, longer and less limited, if also harder in the taking. With our courage and understanding enlarged by this achievement, let us press onward in quest of man's essential desire for peace. As President of the United States, and with the advice and consent of the Senate, I now sign the instruments of ratification of this treaty.
In 1964, China conducts its first nuclear test. China explodes its first atomic bomb at the Lop Nor testing site in Xinjiang province. In total, China conducts 23 atmospheric tests and 22 underground tests at the site. In 1967, Latin America becomes nuclear-free. A treaty prohibiting nuclear weapons in Latin America, the Treaty of Tlatelolco, is signed in Mexico City. Parties agree not to manufacture, test, or acquire nuclear weapons.
In 1974, India conducted its first nuclear test. India conducted an underground nuclear test codenamed the Smiling Buddha. The government falsely claimed it was a peaceful nuclear test.
In 1985, the Greenpeace ship Rainbow Warrior is destroyed in New Zealand on its way to the Marora Atoll to protest French nuclear tests. New Zealand later enacts nuclear-free legislation. In 1986, the Sunday Times publishes information supplied by Israeli nuclear technician Mordecai Vanunu, which leads experts to conclude that Israel may have up to 200 nuclear weapons.
In 1995, on December 15th, Southeast Asia became nuclear-free. The nations of Southeast Asia created a nuclear weapon-free zone stretching from Burma in the west, the Philippines in the east, Laos and Vietnam in the north, and Indonesia in the south. In 1996, on September 24th, the total nuclear test ban was signed. The Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty opens for signatures at the United Nations. China, France, the UK, Russia, and the US all signed the treaty. India says it will not sign the treaty, however.
In October of 2006, North Korea conducted a nuclear test. The North Korean government announced that it has successfully conducted a nuclear test, becoming the 8th country in the world to do so. It provoked international condemnation.
In 2013, Norway hosts the first humanitarian conference. The Norwegian government hosts the first ever intergovernmental conference to examine the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons, bringing together diplomats from 128 states. In 2017, the Nuclear Ban Treaty negotiations begin. At the United Nations, the overwhelming majority of the world's governments begin negotiations on a treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons, leading towards their total elimination.
This is Valerie Vila.
And this is Marina Aziz.
And thanks for joining us on this special on nuclear weapons.